Between 1792 and 1800, more than 400 enslaved men, women, and children built what would one day become the most recognizable building in America. Their names were deliberately erased from official records, and their bodies buried in unmarked graves scattered across the District of Columbia. For 2 centuries, the government insisted these omissions weren't mistakes. They were policy. Then, in 1901, a restoration crew made a discovery beneath the East Wing's foundation that forced the superintendent to order an immediate halt to all excavation. The workers were sworn to secrecy, and the report was buried within hours. What they uncovered suggested that the original construction involved far more than simple labor exploitation. It pointed to the systematic concealment of deaths that had occurred under circumstances the young republic could never afford to acknowledge. Tonight, you'll hear what those records truly contained. But before we continue with the story of how America's greatest symbol was built on suffering deliberately hidden from history, I want to ask you something. If you're listening from Washington, D.C., Virginia, Maryland, or anywhere else in the United States, leave a comment below and tell us where you're from. These stories belong to all of us, and knowing where our listeners are tuning in from helps make this community even stronger. Now, make sure to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, so you never miss the dark chapters of American history they tried to bury. Let's uncover the truth together. That discovery in 1901 wouldn't be the last time someone stumbled upon evidence of what really happened during those 8 years of construction. But to understand why those findings were so dangerous, you need to know how the project began and who was truly forced to build it. Philadelphia had served as the nation's capital in 1790, but the Residence Act passed that July required the creation of a new federal district along the Potomac River. President George Washington himself selected the precise location in January 1791. 10 miles square, carved from land ceded by Maryland and Virginia. But the site was nothing like the grand landscape seen in later paintings. It was malarial swampland, thick with mosquitoes, unbearably humid in summer, and dotted with scattered tobacco plantations worked by enslaved people who had farmed that soil for generations. The commissioners appointed to oversee construction faced an immediate crisis. The federal government was broke. The entire project, the president's house, the Capitol, the department buildings, and the roads, was projected to cost around $400,000, an astronomical figure for a nation still drowning in Revolutionary War debt. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson proposed a solution that seemed elegant in its simplicity. Hire enslaved labor. Their masters would receive a rental fee, typically $5 per month for each enslaved worker, while the workers themselves would get nothing, except basic food and shelter. Jefferson argued in a letter dated March 1792 that this arrangement would keep costs manageable while ensuring that the work continued without delay or complaint. The chief architect, James Hoban, an Irish immigrant who had designed several notable buildings in Charleston, submitted his plans to the President's House in July 1792. His design was heavily inspired by Leinster House in Dublin, with its Georgian symmetry and ambitious proportions. When Washington reviewed the plans, he insisted the building be made even larger, 1/5 bigger than Hoban's original proposal. This expansion meant more labor, more materials, and far more time. Notices were sent throughout Maryland and Virginia, inviting masters to hire out their enslaved workers for the federal construction project. The compensation was steady, and the government promised to return the workers unharmed. That promise would prove worthless. By November 1792, roughly 150 enslaved workers had been gathered at the construction site. They came from plantations across the region: Loudoun County, Charles County, Montgomery County, Prince George's County. Their masters' names appear in the commissioner's payment ledgers: Daniel Carroll, Notley Young, Samuel Davidson, William Brent. But the workers themselves were listed differently. The ledgers recorded only first names, or sometimes not even that, just Negro man or Negro boy, followed by an age estimate: Tom, age 23, Peter, age 19, a boy called Harry, maybe 14, a man named Len, over 50, too old for such brutal work, but sent anyway because his master wanted a monthly payment. The work began immediately, even as winter approached. The first tasks included clearing the site, removing trees, draining the swampy ground, and excavating the foundation. It meant working waist-deep in freezing mud, armed with nothing but shovels, pickaxes, and sheer strength. The commissioner's letters from that first winter briefly mention difficulties with the Negro labor due to weather, but give no details about what those difficulties were. A note dated December 14, 1792, refers to the replacement of 3 workers who could not continue, without explaining why or what happened to them. One worker who left a faint trace in the records was a man named Isaac, hired from plantation owner Samuel Hanson. Isaac was a skilled carpenter, one of several enslaved craftsmen brought in because their expertise was essential. The commissioner's correspondence shows that Isaac worked on the interior carpentry through 1793 and 1794, and that Hanson continued receiving payment for Isaac's labor through November 1794. Then, Isaac's name simply vanishes. There's no note of his return to Hanson's plantation, no record of sale or transfer, just absence, as if he had never existed. Another name that appears often in early records is Peter Lennox, a quarryman enslaved by Martha Custis Peter, George Washington's step-granddaughter. Lennox supervised stone cutting at the government quarry in Aquia, Virginia, where the cream-colored sandstone for the president's house was extracted. The quarry work was among the most dangerous. Massive blocks of stone had to be cut, lifted, and transported without modern machinery. A single mistake could crush a man instantly. Lennox's name appears in payment records through 1796, described as reliable and skilled. After that, his name disappears too. The commissioners, Thomas Johnson, Daniel Carroll, and David Stewart, rotated through various appointments, but their correspondence reveals one constant: anxiety over construction timeline. President Washington wanted the house completed before his. Washington's term ended in 1797, and that looming deadline created immense pressure for the enslaved laborers who built the house. Letters exchanged between the commissioners and Hoban mention working from dawn until dark whenever weather allowed, and even using double crews for the foundation to meet impossible deadlines. Those brief notes hint at a much harsher truth: 16-hour days, 7 days a week during good weather, with no compensation beyond the bare minimum needed to survive. The living conditions were just as brutal. The enslaved workers were housed in temporary wooden shacks near the construction site, crude barracks offering little protection from the cold, rain, or heat. An expense record from March 1793 notes the purchase of straw for Negro quarters, suggesting the workers slept directly on the ground, using straw as their only bedding. Another entry from August 1793 authorized the purchase of saltfish and cornmeal to feed the enslaved workforce, the cheapest food possible. No meat, no vegetables, just enough to keep them alive and working. Disease was inevitable. The swampy land bred malaria, typhoid, and dysentery. The commissioner's letters occasionally mentioned sickness among the workers, always described as an inconvenience to construction progress. One note from June 1793 complains that the flux has taken hold among the Negro laborers, reducing the workforce by nearly 1/3. The flux, another word for dysentery, could kill within days of severe. The letter said nothing about medical treatment or recovery, only about the delay it caused. Medical care for enslaved workers was minimal, if it existed at all. The commissioners hired a physician named William Thornton to attend to laborers, but his payment records reveal a clear disparity. He was paid far less for treating enslaved workers than for treating free white ones. Even more telling, Thornton's bills show far fewer visits to the enslaved, despite their overwhelming numbers. When an enslaved worker became too ill to continue, the most common solution was to send them back to their master and hire a replacement. That practice left no record of what became of those who were returned, whether they recovered, died, or were sold to recoup the lost income. The Scottish stonemason Colin Williamson kept more detailed records than most. He supervised much of the stonework and maintained a personal diary, which survived in his family's papers until it was donated to the Library of Congress in 1968. His entries from 1794 and 1795 offer a rare window into the daily brutality. The Negro men worked the stone despite bleeding hands. He wrote in April 1794, "They are given no gloves, no proper tools to their hands, yet are expected to produce the same quality as trained masons. Several have infections that should be tended. I mentioned this to the commissioner's representative, who said treatment would be provided when time allowed. Time, it seems, never allows." Williamson's diary also records an incident from July 1794, an event that appears nowhere in official documentation. "Today," he wrote, "a scaffold collapsed on the south wall. 3 men fell, 2 of them Negroes. The white man was carried to the physician immediately. The 2 Negroes were left where they fell for nearly an hour before anyone attended to them. One appears to have a broken back. I suspect he will not survive, and if he does, he will never walk again. This troubles me greatly, but I am told this is not my concern." The man with the suspected broken back was likely a worker named Ben, enslaved by William Brent. Ben's name appears in payment ledgers through June 1794, then disappears. Brent continued receiving payment for Negro labor in July and August 1794, but the listed name changes to Negro Man Jim. This pattern, sudden substitutions of names and payment records with no explanation, occurs repeatedly throughout the construction period. It suggests that workers were quietly replaced, while the reasons for their disappearance were deliberately left unrecorded. By 1795, the shell of the structure was mostly complete, but the interior work would take several more years. The project expanded to include not only the president's house, but also the surrounding landscape, roads, and supporting buildings. This expansion actually increased the number of laborers needed. At its peak, around 1798, somewhere between 400 and 500 people worked on-site and in related operations like quarries, brick kilns, and lumber mills. The majority of them were enslaved. As the years went on, the commissioner's papers began to show a subtle but telling shift. Earlier letters openly referred to Negro carpenters, Negro laborers, Negro quarrymen. After 1795, those terms faded. The language became vague. Workers hired from area plantations, contracted labor, servants. That change wasn't accidental. As the project gained public visibility, the commissioners understood that the optics were dangerous. Here was the home of the president, the grand symbol of the young republic, being built by people who had no freedom within it. George Washington himself visited the construction site several times during the 1790s. His diary entries from those visits mention architectural progress and concerns about deadlines, but not once do they acknowledge the enslaved laborers working before him, even though they made up at least 70% of the workforce. That silence speaks volumes about how the founders chose to see, or not to see, the labor that built their institutions. The white workers on site, mostly immigrants from Ireland and Scotland, earned actual wages, typically $1 per day for skilled craftsmen, 50 cents for common laborers. They could quit if they wished. They could voice complaints about working conditions. Their names were recorded with surnames, places of origin, and next of kin. When they were injured, they received medical care and financial compensation. When they died, they were buried in marked graves, and their families were informed. None of these rights or dignities applied to the enslaved. They had no choice, no voice, no recourse. They built the house stone by stone, brick by brick, knowing they would never walk through its doors as anything other than servants, knowing their children would inherit their chains, knowing their names would vanish, while the names of the architects, commissioners, and presidents would be etched into history books. But some of the enslaved workers left marks of their own, small, deliberate acts of presence that would only be discovered centuries later. In the spring of 1796, James Hoban reported a strange problem to the commissioners. Several stone blocks being set into the north wall bore unusual markings, shallow scratches that seemed intentional rather than accidental damage from quarrying or transport. In a letter dated April 3rd, 1796, Hoban described them as crude symbols or letters, their purpose unknown. He asked whether the stones should be replaced or simply turned inward so the marks would not be visible. The commissioners replied on April 10th, instructing Hoban to turn the stones inward and continue construction. Their letter dismissed the matter entirely. The markings are likely meaningless scratches from handling. There is no need to delay work for such trivialities. The incident was considered closed, but the markings weren't meaningless. They were names. Enslaved stonecutters had carved their names, or sometimes just their initials, into the very blocks they shaped. The carvings were subtle, easily mistaken for random scratches, unless you knew what to look for. These were quiet acts of defiance and remembrance, carried out at immense personal risk. If caught, the punishment would have been severe. Yet they did it anyway. Men whose names appeared in ledgers only as Tom or Peter or Negro Man etched fragments of their identities into stone. Some carved H, others PL, and a few, like Isaac, dared to carve their full names. They sent those stones forward to become permanent parts of the president's house. It was their silent way of saying, "We were here. We built this. Remember us." Hoban never mentioned finding more marked stones after that. Either he stopped noticing them, or he stopped reporting them. Given the commissioner's dismissive response, the latter seems far more likely. Why bother to raise an issue they had already decided didn't matter? The carved stones wouldn't be rediscovered until 1902, during Theodore Roosevelt's extensive renovation of the White House. As workers removed plaster from interior walls, they found stones bearing the same strange carvings, turned inward, exactly as Hoban had been instructed to place them. The renovation supervisor, a man named Charles McKim, noted the discovery in his private records. Found various stones with crude markings on interior faces. Some appeared to be initials or names, origin uncertain, likely made by workers during original construction. McKim seemed to recognize their significance, but no official report was ever filed. The stones remained where they were, sealed behind new plaster, their story once again hidden from sight. But the marked stones were only a small piece of what had been deliberately concealed. The real cover-up began in the summer of 1797, after an event that could have destroyed the project's already fragile reputation. July 1797 brought one of the worst heat waves anyone could remember. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees for days on end. The combination of relentless heat, swampy humidity, and scarce clean water created catastrophic conditions for the workers. Within 2 weeks, dozens of enslaved laborers fell ill with what the commissioners vaguely described as summer fevers. Urgent letters were sent to plantation owners. "Your workers have taken sick and cannot continue. Send replacements." These letters are unusually numerous for that time of year. At least 23 survive in the archives, all written between late July and early August 1797. Each one requests immediate replacement workers, suggesting that far more than 23 people had fallen ill, perhaps dozens more. What happened to those sick workers? The commissioner's papers contain no follow-up, no explanation. The replies that do survive from plantation owners are chillingly brief. Received. Replacement sent. No mention of whether the original workers were returned. No mention of recovery or death. Nothing. Colin Williamson's diary entries from this same period are harrowing. "The sickness spreads through the Negro quarters like wildfire," he wrote on July 23, 1797. "I have seen at least a dozen men too weak to stand, yet there is no physician attending them. They lie in those wretched barracks, burning with fever, and no one seems concerned, except to know when the replacements will arrive. I asked the commissioner's man what provisions had been made for treatment. He told me the sick ones had been moved to an isolated area to prevent contagion. When I asked where this isolated area was, he became evasive and told me it was not my affair." His next entry, dated July 28th, is even more disturbing. "I have learned where the sick are being kept. There's a hastily built shed near the old kiln site, perhaps a quarter-mile from the main construction. I walked there this morning, though I was told to remain in my assigned area. What I found troubles me deeply. At least 20 men lie inside that shed with almost no care. One woman, a young girl really, no more than 16, tends to them as best she could with nothing but water and rags. The heat inside that shed is unbearable. Many of the men are clearly dying. I confronted the overseer about this barbaric neglect, and he told me plainly that the commissioners cannot afford to halt construction for illness. The sick will either recover or they won't, he said. My job is stonework, not nursing. I feel ashamed to be part of this enterprise. The young girl Williamson mentioned appears nowhere in any official record. Enslaved women did work on the project, mostly as cooks and laundresses, but their presence was rarely documented. This particular girl may have been brought in temporarily to tend to the sick, an enslaved woman with nursing experience, hired just for the crisis, and then returned to her master when it was over or when it wasn't. Williamson's final entry on the subject, dated August 5, 1797, is chilling in its simplicity. The shed near the kiln is empty now. All of them. I asked what happened to the men who were there. I was told they had recovered and been sent back to their plantations, but I saw no wagons arrive to take them. I saw no men walking or being carried away. The shed is simply empty, and no one will speak of it. I suspect something terrible has occurred, but I have no proof, and no one to tell would care. What happened to those sick workers? If they truly recovered and been sent back, there would be records, letters from plantation owners confirming their return, maybe complaints about weakened laborers, something, but instead there's silence, a void in the archives where answers should exist. One of the few surviving plantation letters from that time offers a troubling clue. Samuel Hanson, the man who had hired out Isaac the carpenter, wrote to the commissioners in September 1797, asking about 3 of his enslaved workers sent to the project in June. I have received payment for their labor through July, Hanson wrote, but they have not been returned as I expected when I sent replacement workers in August. I would like to know their whereabouts and when they might return, as I have need of them for harvest work. The commissioner's reply, dated September 18, 1797, is maddeningly vague. The workers to which you refer were afflicted with summer illness and could not continue. Arrangements were made for their care. We will inquire into their present situation and inform you accordingly. No follow-up letter exists to show if they ever did. Hanson's later correspondence never mentions those 3 men again, suggesting either he received a private answer or simply gave up asking. But not everyone stopped asking. In November 1797, another plantation owner, William Brent, sent a sharp letter to the commissioners demanding the return of 5 enslaved workers who hadn't come back despite being replaced months earlier. I have lost use of 5 able workers for whom I continue to receive payment, he wrote. Yet the workers themselves have not returned. This arrangement cannot continue. I demand either the return of these workers or an explanation of why they cannot return, along with compensation for their loss if they have died in federal service. This letter struck a nerve. The commissioners replied within 3 days, unusually fast, and their tone was defensive. The workers to which you refer met with unfortunate circumstances during their service. Death occurred despite best efforts at treatment. We regret this outcome, but note that the work they were engaged in carried inherent risks which were known when they were contracted. Payment to you for their labor will cease as of November 1st, 1797. No additional compensation can be provided, so at least 5 of Brent's enslaved workers had died. The commissioners admitted it, but gave no details, no account of how they died, no mention of burial, no word of notifying their families. Their letter treats those deaths as an unfortunate but ordinary business matter. The men died. The payment stopped. The matter was closed. But how many others died? The admission regarding Brent's 5 workers suggests that deaths did happen, and that the truth was being deliberately hidden in the paperwork. If deaths were mentioned only when plantation owners demanded answers, How many more went unrecorded, simply because no one with power bothered to ask? Years later, an architectural historian named Benjamin Latrobe Jr., the son of the famous architect, would study these old documents. In a private 1882 letter, he estimated that between 30 and 50 enslaved people likely perished during construction of the president's house, even though no official records acknowledge any such deaths. Latrobe based his estimate on sudden gaps in the payment ledgers, abrupt worker substitutions, and the unusually high number of replacement requests, especially during the summer of 1797. But even that estimate may have been too low. If 50 people died over 8 years of construction, with hundreds of workers involved, that would actually be a surprisingly low mortality rate for the time. Other major public works of the era, canals, fortifications, harbors, often saw 10 to 15% of enslaved workers die before completion. If that same rate applied here, with 400 to 500 enslaved laborers cycling to the project, the death toll could have reached 40, 75, maybe even more. And then comes the question, where were they buried? That question leads to the superintendent's discovery in 1901, the one that brought the excavation to an immediate halt and bound the workers to sworn silence. That year's restoration involved reinforcing the foundation beneath the east wing. As the crew dug down to expose the original stones from 1792, about 6 feet below ground level, they found bones. Human bones. According to the superintendent's private notes, there were at least a dozen skulls, along with countless other remains, buried hastily, without coffins or markers, directly in the dirt beneath the building's foundation. The superintendent, a man named Henry Reed, instantly grasped the gravity of what they'd uncovered. If word spread the human remains, possibly those of enslaved workers, were buried beneath the White House, it could ignite outrage, investigations, and scandal. That very afternoon, Reed made his decision. He ordered the bones reburied in the exact spot where they'd been found. He instructed the workers to remain silent and shifted the renovation to another part of the foundation. Reed kept a personal diary, later donated by his descendants to the National Archives in 1978. In his entry from October 12, 1901, he describes the discovery in haunting detail. We found them approximately 6 feet down, just outside the original eastern foundation line. The bones were mixed together, with no sign of proper burial I could discern. Some skulls showed signs of trauma, though I am no medical expert. We counted at least 12 skulls, possibly more, as some were fragmentary. The Negro workers on our crew became very quiet when we uncovered them. One old man, Joseph, who's worked on the grounds for 40 years, said he'd heard stories from his grandfather about men buried near the house during its construction. He said his grandfather called them the forgotten ones. We reburied everything before day's end. I instructed all workers that nothing had been found, and that anyone who spoke of it would be immediately dismissed. That night, I felt ill, thinking of those poor souls buried like refuse beneath this great house. Henry Reed never filed an official report about the discovery. He never informed the president's staff or the Department of the Interior. He simply made sure the bones stayed hidden and took the secret to his grave in 1924. Only the discovery of his diary, decades later, revealed what had been found and quietly reburied. And the bones raised terrible questions. If enslaved workers were buried right outside the foundation, had they died during construction and been disposed of as quickly and quietly as possible? Were these the same men who vanished from the records during the summer of 1797? And were there more burial sites still hidden somewhere beneath the White House grounds? Reed's diary mentioned that the bones showed signs of trauma. That could have meant many things. Injuries from accidents on the site, the brutal toll of hard labor, or something far worse. He didn't elaborate, and since Reed refused to allow any proper forensic study, the truth about how those people died will remain forever unknown. What is certain is this: at least a dozen human beings were buried in unmarked graves on the White House grounds. And this fact was deliberately concealed, first in 1797 and then again in 1901, when the evidence was literally in hand. Someone decided both times that those deaths were better left unacknowledged. But who made that decision in 1797? And were those deaths truly accidental or something darker? That question would haunt the project's later history. The president's house wasn't completed until November of 1800, when John Adams became the first president to live there. By then, most of the enslaved workers who had built it were gone, returned to plantations scattered across Maryland and Virginia. Their part in the creation of the building was already being erased from the official story. The commissioner's final report, submitted in December 1800, is a masterpiece of omission. It lists every cost, every architectural feature, every problem solved. It praises James Hoban's design and George Washington's grand vision. It thanks the skilled craftsmen who brought the structure to life. But it never once mentions that the majority of those craftsmen were enslaved people, men and women who received no pay, no recognition, and in some cases, not even a burial. When Thomas Jefferson moved into the house in March 1801, he brought with him enslaved workers from Monticello, cooks, servants, and laborers to maintain the property. For Jefferson, their presence in the president's house was not a contradiction. It was simply the world as he knew it. He could write beautifully about liberty and equality, all while surrounded by those who had none. He never seemed to grasp the unbearable dissonance of that reality. The building became known as the White House decades later, though the name's true origin is disputed. Some say it came from the white paint that covered the sandstone walls after the British burned the building in 1814. Others claim it was always called that, referring to the pale color of the aqueous sandstone itself. Either way, the name stuck, and with it, a mythology, a clean, patriotic story about the house's construction that was almost entirely false. Throughout the 19th century, official White House histories barely mentioned the enslaved workforce. And when they did, it was in soft and careful language. Servants, workers from nearby plantations, contracted labor. The implication was always that these were free, paid employees doing ordinary work for ordinary wages. The truth, that they were enslaved, unpaid, and forced to labor without choice, was smoothed over, sanitized, and rendered invisible. Even the few accounts that did acknowledge slavery's role downplayed it. An 1831 guidebook to Washington described the building as erected by skilled craftsmen and laborers brought together through the commissioner's diligent efforts. Technically true, but brought together makes it sound like cooperation, not coercion. The guidebook's author, Jonathan Elliott, knew better. He had studied the commissioner's papers himself. But he chose words that would not disturb the reader's patriotic pride. And so, the pattern of selective memory continued. Major renovations in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1860s were covered in detail by newspapers, but not once did a journalist ask who built the original structure or under what conditions. Presidents gave speeches and tours celebrating the architecture's European influence, Irish and Scottish craftsmanship, but never spoke of the African hands that actually raised the walls. Some people did know the truth. They just didn't have a platform to tell it. Among the enslaved community in Washington and the surrounding countryside, the real story of the White House lived on, passed quietly from generation to generation. Elders who had worked on the project told their children and grandchildren what it had really been like. They described the suffocating heat, the sickness, the friends who disappeared and never came home. They spoke of bones buried in the soil, of names carved into stone, of marks no one was ever meant to see. One of those stories survived, preserved in a remarkable document discovered in 1978. Among a collection of papers donated to Howard University was a handwritten account by a woman named Celia Robertson, born into slavery in 1819. Celia wrote down the stories her grandfather Thomas had told her in the 1840s. He had worked on the president's house in the 1790s. Through her handwriting, his memories lived on, one of the only first-hand accounts of what life on that construction site was truly like. Her grandfather's stories, filtered through her memory, paint a picture far darker than any official record. She wrote, "Grandfather Thomas said they worked until their hands bled and their backs couldn't straighten. The white overseers didn't see them as men, but as tools like hammers and saws. When a tool broke, you got another. When a man fell, you got another man. He said they buried friends at night when no one was watching and said prayers that nobody wrote down. His friend Peter carved his name into a stone and told grandfather, "They'll forget us, but the stone will remember long after we're gone. Our names will be in those walls, even if nobody can see them." Grandfather cried when he told me that. He said Peter never came home. Said he got sick one summer and they took him away, and that was the last anyone saw of him. Celia Robertson wrote that her grandfather never escaped those memories. He had nightmares about that place for the rest of his life. She said he would wake up in the night, trembling, whispering that So I can hear the cries of dying men in that shed where they locked away the sick ones. He said he tried to help, to bring them water, but the overseers stopped him every time. He said you could hear them calling out for their mothers, their wives, for water, for mercy, voices fading day by day until the cries went silent and the shed stood empty. No one ever said what happened to those men. Thomas also described the terrible scaffolding collapse that left several workers dead, confirming Colin Williamson's diary entry. Grandfather said he watched the scaffold snap, sending 3 men tumbling down, 1 white man and 2 colored. The white man was carried off immediately and cared for. The 2 black men lay broken on the ground for nearly an hour before anyone even looked at them. One screamed in agony, his leg twisted unnaturally. The other didn't move at all. Eventually, both were taken to the shed. Grandfather never saw either of them again. Robertson's handwritten account remained unknown until it was found in Howard University's archives and mentioned in a small academic journal in 1982. Even then, it received little attention. Mainstream historians largely ignored it, perhaps because it clashed with a comfortable, polished version of the building's origins that had been accepted for nearly 2 centuries. Yet the document raised haunting questions. If Thomas's memories were true, and there's no reason to think his granddaughter invented them, then the official record had deliberately erased evidence of deadly conditions and concealed numerous deaths. The shed where they put the sick ones matched the exact location described by Colin Williamson. The scaffolding accident Thomas recalled aligned perfectly with Williamson's entry. 2 separate witnesses, separated by generations, telling the same story, each confirming the other. This convergence of testimony suggested what many historians had long suspected but could never prove, that the construction of the President's house cost the lives of many enslaved people, and that those deaths were intentionally omitted from history. Physical evidence supported these claims too. In 1978, the same year Robertson's account surfaced, a team of archaeologists conducted a detailed survey of the White House grounds for a historical documentation project. They used ground-penetrating radar to scan areas untouched since the 1790s. The radar revealed anomalies resembling unmarked graves in at least 3 locations. One site was near where Henry Reed's crew uncovered bones in 1901. Another was close to the old kiln site mentioned in Williamson's diary. The third, chillingly, lay within what is now the Rose Garden. The archaeologists noted their discoveries in a technical report, but advised against excavation. The report read, given the political sensitivity of potentially discovering human remains on the White House grounds, and the likelihood that such remains belong to enslaved individuals buried without record, we recommend that these sites be left undisturbed and marked as historically sensitive for future reference. In other words, we know there are likely bodies here, but digging them up will be too politically inconvenient. So just note it and move on. This decision, like Henry Reed's silence in 1901 and the commissioner's choices in the 1790s, placed reputation above truth and human dignity. Those buried in unmarked graves were forgotten in death, just as they've been exploited in life. Even when evidence surfaced, it was buried again, literally or figuratively. Architectural historian Benjamin Latrobe Jr., who estimated that 30 to 50 enslaved workers died during construction, became obsessed with uncovering the real toll. In the 1880s, After reviewing surviving commissioner's papers, Latrobe began interviewing elderly African Americans in the Washington area, hoping to preserve their oral histories before that generation disappeared. He collected accounts from 17 people whose grandparents or great-grandparents had worked on the president's house. Their stories echoed one another. Tales of brutal conditions, scarce food and water, rampant sickness, and workers who vanished and were never seen again. Several recalled that the summer of 1797 was especially deadly. One man told Latrobe, "My grandmother said her uncle worked on the president's building and caught the fever that summer when it was so hot. They took him away from the others, and when her mother went to find him, they told her he died, but wouldn't say where he was buried. She looked for his grave for years, but never found it." Latrobe compiled these testimonies into a manuscript titled The Hidden Cost: Enslaved Labor in Construction of Federal Buildings. He intended it to correct the sanitized versions of history, but no publisher would touch it. For 5 years, every submission came back with the same reasons: too controversial, not suitable for readers, lacks documentation, or most tellingly, it would harm the reputation of respected institutions. Latrobe died in 1887, bitter and defeated. His manuscript wasn't published until 1934, when a small academic press printed just 500 copies. It sold poorly and vanished quickly from circulation. Today, only about 24 copies are known to exist, scattered across libraries and private collections. Even when the truth was written down, even when it was available, it couldn't break through the comforting myth. The White House had become too sacred, too symbolic of democracy and American ideals. Admitting that it was built on the suffering, exploitation, and forgotten graves of enslaved people meant confronting a truth that the nation wasn't ready to face. So, once again, the truth was buried. The truth remained buried, quite literally in some cases, beneath decades and then centuries of silence. The president's house was finally completed in November 1800, when John Adams became the first president to live there. By that time, most of the enslaved workers who had built it had been sent back to their plantations scattered across Maryland and Virginia. Their contribution to one of the nation's most symbolic buildings was already being erased from the official story. The commissioner's final report, submitted in December 1800, stands as a masterpiece of omission. It listed every architectural feature, every expense, and every challenge overcome. It praised James Hoban's design and George Washington's vision. It thanked the skilled craftsmen who brought the grand building to life. Yet nowhere did it mention that most of those craftsmen were enslaved, men who received no pay, no recognition, and in some cases, not even a marked grave. When Thomas Jefferson moved in after his inauguration in March 1801, he brought with him his own enslaved workers from Monticello, cooks, servants, and laborers to maintain the house and its grounds. For Jefferson, their presence wasn't seen as ironic or hypocritical. It was simply the accepted order of things. He could write passionately about liberty while surrounded by men and women who had none, seemingly blind to the staggering contradiction of his own life. Among the enslaved community in Washington and the nearby plantations, however, the truth was not forgotten. The story of the building's construction lived on through whispers and quiet warnings. Elderly people who had worked on the project told their children what it was truly like: the relentless heat, the sickness, and the friends who vanished without a trace. They spoke of bones buried somewhere on the grounds, of stones carved with secret markings, and of names no one would ever remember. One of those stories survived in an extraordinary way. In 1843, a woman named Celia Robertson, born into slavery in 1819, began secretly writing down her grandfather Thomas's memories of working on the president's house in the 1790s. She risked everything to preserve those words, knowing that enslaved people caught with written material could face brutal punishment. Her fragile writings, hidden away and passed down to her family, will remain unknown to historians for generations. Thomas's recollections, filtered through his granddaughter's careful memory and secret pen, painted a far darker picture than any official record. Grandfather Thomas said they worked until their hands bled and their backs could no longer straighten. He said the white overseers didn't see them as men, but as tools, like hammers and saws. When a tool broke, you got another. When a man fell, you got another man. He said they buried their friends at night, when no one was watching. They whispered prayers over them that no one ever wrote down. One story matched details found in other sources. Thomas said his friend Peter carved his name into a stone and told him, "They'll forget us, but the stone will remember. Long after we're gone, our names will be in those walls, even if no one can see them." Grandfather cried when he told her that. He said Peter never came home. He got sick one summer, they took him away, and that was the last anyone saw of him. Thomas also told her about the shed near the kiln, the place where the sick were taken during that terrible summer of 1797. He said he tried to bring them water, but the overseers wouldn't let him near. He remembered the cries, men calling out for their mothers, their wives, for water, for mercy. Then, after a few days, the cries stopped. The shed was empty. No one ever said what had happened to those men. Thomas had nightmares about it until the day he died. If this story unsettles you as much as it should, take a moment to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think really happened to those men in that shed? Every theory, every discussion helps keep these buried histories alive, so they're never forgotten again. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because stories like this must be told and remembered. Celia Robertson's account stayed hidden within her family for decades after her death in 1889. By then, the official histories of the president's house had already hardened into a comfortable mythology, one that barely acknowledged enslaved labor at all. An 1831 guidebook described the building as erected by skilled craftsmen and laborers brought together through the federal commissioner's diligent efforts. That phrase, brought together, made forced labor sound like proud, voluntary work. From time to time, however, fragments of truth resurfaced, only to be quietly covered up again. In 1867, during President Andrew Johnson's administration, workers repairing the foundation discovered artifacts clearly left by 18th century laborers. Among them was a small, 2-inch wooden disc, carefully carved on both sides. One side bore the initials PL, the other the date 1796. Recognizing its possible significance, the maintenance supervisor brought the disc to the White House steward. The steward noted in his daily log as curious article found during repair work. Appears old, and then placed it in a storage cabinet. No one investigated further. The disc sat there, forgotten, just like the man who had likely carved it, Peter Lennox, remembered by no one for 70 years. That same year, another discovery occurred, one the steward didn't include in his official records. In a private letter to his brother, dated September 14, 1867, he wrote, "During foundation repairs this month, the workers uncovered what appeared to be human remains in the soil near the eastern wall. Old bones, several skulls. The men became quite disturbed, especially the colored workers. I consulted with the president's secretary about what should be done. We agreed the matter was best handled quietly. The bones were reburied in the same location, and work was moved to another area. I suspect these were laborers who died during the original construction and were buried hastily, but raising questions about it now would serve no good purpose, and might cause unnecessary scandal. The steward's decision to stay silent, just like those before him, ensured that the truth would remain buried once again. Reburying the bones and staying silent set a precedent that would be followed again decades later. The dead would remain buried, and the questions would remain unasked. In 1891, the Interior Department hired a historian named Herbert Braftoff to write a comprehensive history of federal buildings. Braftoff was granted access to archives that no historian before him had ever seen, documents stored away for decades, including correspondence between commissioners and plantation owners that had been locked in a War Department warehouse and largely forgotten. What Braftoff discovered in those yellowed letters disturbed him deeply. Among them was an exchange between William Brent and the commissioners, where they openly admitted that 5 of Brent's enslaved workers had died. He found at least a dozen similar exchanges with other plantation owners. He uncovered records of payment disputes where owners demanded compensation for workers who had never returned. He found medical bills suggesting that far more men had required treatment than the commissioners ever acknowledged publicly. But the most haunting discovery was a letter written by Samuel Davidson to his brother, dated December 1797, a letter that apparently had never been sent. Davidson had written it in a tone of clear anger and disbelief. I have received notification from the federal commissioners that 3 of my workers have died while in their service this past summer. They died in July, supposedly of fever, though no physician examined them as far as I can determine. Brother, these were strong, healthy men I sent to Washington in June. 3 months later, all 3 are dead, and I am told this is simply unfortunate luck. I do not believe it was luck at all. I believe the conditions at that construction site are barbaric. The overseers are cruel and negligent, and men are dying from abuse as much as from any fever. The letter continued with an accusation that made Braftall stop and reread the lines twice. I have spoken with other owners who sent workers to that cursed project. William Brent lost 5 men, and was told nothing until he demanded answers. I spoke with Notley Young, who said at least a dozen of his workers returned sick and weakened, and 3 died within weeks of coming home. The true toll of this construction is far higher than anyone will admit. I will not send another living soul to work on federal projects. Braftall sat in silence in that archive room for a long time after reading Davidson's letter. If Davidson's information was correct, and Braftall had already confirmed Brent's 5 deaths through other documents, then at least 24 enslaved workers had died that Davidson knew about, and Davidson himself had written. The true toll is far higher than anyone will admit. Braftall compiled his findings into a section of his manuscript titled The Human Cause of Construction. He wrote carefully but truthfully about what the evidence revealed, that the construction of the President's house, that great symbol of American democracy, had been accomplished in large part through the forced labor of enslaved people. The conditions they endured were brutal. The compensation they received was nothing, and the deaths that occurred, which available evidence suggested numbered at least 40 individuals, possibly more, had been deliberately obscured in official records and completely omitted from every subsequent history of the building. When Braftall submitted his draft manuscript to the Interior Department in early 1892, the response came swiftly. A letter dated March 3rd, 1892, instructed him in no uncertain terms. While we appreciate your thorough research, we feel that the section regarding unfortunate incidents during construction does not serve the purpose of this commission history, which is to celebrate the architectural and engineering achievements of our federal buildings. Please remove this section entirely and focus on the positive aspects of these great American landmarks. Braftall protested. He wrote back, arguing that any complete history must include uncomfortable truths, that omitting the deaths and suffering of enslaved workers was a betrayal of both historical accuracy and human decency. The Interior Department's reply was even more direct. Remove the section or the book would not be published, and he would not be paid. Braftall had spent 2 years on the project. He had a family to support. He removed the section, but he couldn't bring himself to destroy it. He kept the deleted pages among his personal papers, along with copies of the most damning letters he had found. On the folder, he wrote a note, "The truth about how the President's house was built, removed from my history at government insistence. May someone braver than I eventually tell this story." HB, April 1892. The published version of Braftall's history appeared in 1893. It contained exactly 1 paragraph about enslaved labor. The project employed workers from area plantations under contract with their masters, a common practice of the era. These workers contributed their skills to construction of this magnificent building. Braftall's deleted section, with its careful documentation of deaths, Davidson's damning letter, and the estimate of 40 or more casualties, remained hidden in his personal papers. When Braftov died in 1918, his family stored his papers in boxes, unaware of the historical weight they contained. Decades earlier, the architecture historian Benjamin Latrobe Jr., son of the famous architect, had spent years in the 1880s trying to piece together the true story behind construction of the president's house. He had reviewed every record he could access. He had interviewed elderly African Americans whose grandparents or great-grandparents had worked on the project. He collected 17 oral histories, all consistent in describing brutal conditions, rampant sickness, and people who vanished and never returned. Latrobe compiled everything into a manuscript he titled The Hidden Cost: Enslaved Labor in the Construction of Federal Buildings. Based on missing payment records and the testimonies he gathered, he estimated that between 30 and 50 enslaved people had likely perished during construction of the president's house. For 5 years, Latrobe tried to find a publisher. Every response was the same: too controversial, not suitable for public readership, lacked sufficient documentation, and most tellingly, would damage the reputation of the nation's founding institutions. Latrobe died in 1887, his manuscript never published. His papers were eventually donated to a university library, where they sat for decades, uncatalogued, unread, and stored away in boxes labeled simply Latrobe, Architectural Notes. The truth was there. It existed, documented in archives, hidden in family papers, and buried within university collections. But it could never gain traction against the established narrative. The mythology of the White House as a flawless symbol of American ideals was too important, too deeply woven into national identity, to acknowledge that it had been built on the backs of enslaved people. People who had suffered, died, and been forgotten would mean confronting a reality that most Americans in the late 19th century simply weren't willing to face. Then, in October 1901, everything changed, at least a few men who knew what they had found. That autumn, a restoration project was underway to reinforce the foundations that had begun to settle after more than a century. Workers dug down to expose the original stones laid back in 1792. Around 6 feet below the surface, one worker's shovel struck something that wasn't stone or soil. He called his foreman over. They dug more carefully, and then they saw it. Bones. Human bones. A skull. Then another. And then more. The foreman immediately halted the crew and sent for Superintendent Henry Reed. Reed arrived within the hour and examined the site. At least a dozen skulls were visible, along with countless other bones, all buried hastily, without any sign of coffins, markers, or ceremony. No artifacts, no names, just human remains discarded beneath the very foundation of the president's house. Reed was 53 years old and had worked on some of Washington's most prominent buildings over his 30-year career. The moment he saw what they had uncovered, he understood exactly what it was and exactly what it meant. He also understood what would happen if word of this discovery ever became public. It would trigger questions, investigations, and revelations about a history that had been carefully buried for more than a century. Within an hour, Reed made his decision. The crew would rebury everything exactly where it had been found. They would tell no one. The foundation work would move to the west side of the building. Every man on the crew was told that speaking about this discovery to anyone would mean immediate dismissal. The black laborers on the crew had fallen silent when the bones were uncovered. One older man, a worker named Joseph, who had worked on the White House grounds for 40 years, quietly approached Reed as the reburial began. "Sir," Joseph said softly, "my father worked on building this house back in the old days. He used to tell stories before he died. He said there were men buried near the house, workers who died, and nobody wanted to make a fuss about it. He called them the forgotten ones." Reed looked at him. "Did your father say how many?" "He didn't know for sure, sir," Joseph replied. "But he said it was more than a few. He said there was a bad summer, terrible hot, and a lot of men got sick. He said they took the sick ones away to a shed somewhere, and after a while, you didn't hear them anymore. Folks knew they died, but nobody said it plain. Just buried them quiet and kept working. Reed nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me that, Joseph. But what we found today, it doesn't leave this site. You understand? Yes, sir, Joseph said after a pause. I understand. But those men deserve better than being buried twice, with no one knowing. I know they do, Reed answered quietly. But that's not a decision I can make. That evening, Reed sat alone in his small boarding house room near the White House and wrote in his private diary. We found them today. At least 12 skulls, possibly more, buried roughly outside the original Eastern Foundation. No coffins, no markers, no dignity. Some skulls showed signs of trauma, though I'm no expert. Joseph, one of our colored workers, said his father told stories about men buried near the house during construction. He called them the Forgotten Ones, an apt name. We reburied everything this afternoon. I told the crew that anyone who speaks of this will be dismissed immediately. I've moved the foundation work to the west side. This discovery cannot become public knowledge. Still, I've felt ill all evening, thinking of those souls buried like refuse beneath this great symbol of our republic. Reed never filed an official report. He never told the president's staff or the Interior Department. He kept the secret until his death 23 years later. Only his private diary, preserved by his family but never carefully read, recorded what had been found that October day in 1901. The bones that Reed and his crew quietly reburied that afternoon remain in the ground, forgotten in the 20th century just as they had been in the 18th. The men they belonged to, some likely listed on the long-lost paper sealed in the foundation, others who had carved their names into stones now hidden behind plaster, stayed nameless, unacknowledged, unmourned. But the discovery haunted Reed. Though he never spoke of it, he could not stop thinking about the questions it raised. If at least 12 people were buried just outside the Eastern Foundation, how many more were buried elsewhere on the grounds? The property spanned 18 acres. Could there be other graves that had never been disturbed? How many people had truly died building this house? Reed thought about Joseph's story, about the shed where the sick workers were taken during that terrible summer. He thought about the skulls showing signs of violence. And he thought about the silence in the records, how no official documents acknowledged any of it. Someone in 1797 had decided those deaths weren't worth recording. Someone in 1867 had decided the bones found during repairs should be quietly reburied. And now Reed himself, in 1901, had done the same. The pattern was unmistakable. The dead would stay buried. The truth would stay hidden. And the company mythology surrounding this building, the symbol of democracy and freedom, would remain untouched. The following spring, in March 1902, workers were removing old plaster from interior walls during another round of renovations when they made a new discovery, one that architect James Hoban himself had documented back in 1796. Behind the plaster, on stone that had been turned inward so their carved sides wouldn't be seen, were shallow marks. They weren't random scratches. They were names. Initials, small, deliberate engravings carved by the very people who had shaped those stones. One worker noticed a stone with clear letters, H. Another stone had the letters PL. A third showed what appeared to be Isaac, carved carefully into cream-colored sandstone. The workmen called over their supervisor, who examined the markings for a moment before ordering them to replace the plaster immediately and not to discuss what they had found. But one worker, a young man named Timothy O'Brien, quietly made a sketch of 3 of the carved stones before they were covered again. That evening, he wrote in his diary, "Found names carved in the stones today. Old James, the colored man who works in the basement, says those were likely the names of enslaved men who built this place. He says they carved them so they wouldn't be forgotten. The supervisor told us to cover them back up and not talk about it. Seems wrong, leaving those names hidden, but I suppose that's how it's always been." O'Brien's sketch showed 3 sets of markings, T on one stone, PL on another, and Isaac on a third, Peter Lennox, Thomas Isaac. The same names that had appeared in the commissioner's payment ledgers a century earlier were now rediscovered carved into stone, and once again immediately hidden from sight. That afternoon, the plaster was replaced. The names were buried behind it once more. The workers moved on to other walls, other rooms, other tasks. Within a week, everyone had stopped thinking about the carved stones, if they had thought about them at all. President Theodore Roosevelt, who occupied the White House during those renovations, was never told about the bones found the previous year, nor the carved names discovered that spring. The information was considered irrelevant to his concerns. Superintendent Reed had kept his silence, and the renovation supervisors saw no reason to break it. By the summer of 1902, all the renovation work was complete. The White House looked magnificent, its structure reinforced, its interiors refreshed. Visitors admired its beauty and historical importance. Tour guides spoke proudly about the architecture, the presidents who had lived there, and the momentous decisions made within its walls. But no one mentioned the bones buried beneath the grounds. No one spoke of the names hidden behind the plaster. No one acknowledged the terrible price that had been paid to build this grand symbol of American democracy. In plantation communities across Maryland and Virginia, elderly people still told stories about grandparents and great-grandparents who had worked on the president's house construction and never returned home. These stories were passed down through generations, preserved within African-American families even as they vanished from official history. By 1902, most of those old storytellers were gone. Their children remembered fragments, but with every generation the details grew vaguer. Names were forgotten, events blurred together. The truth became harder and harder to tell apart from memory or myth. Celia Robertson had died in 1889, and her carefully hidden writings about her grandfather Thomas's experiences remained sealed away, unknown to anyone outside her immediate family. Herbert Bancroft's deleted manuscript pages sat in a box in his study. Benjamin Latrobe Jr.'s unpublished book gathered dust in a university archive. The White House steward's 1867 letter to his brother, describing the discovery of bones, had been discarded after his brother's death. Henry Reed's private diary sat untouched on a bedroom shelf, unread by anyone. The truth still existed, scattered across letters, journals, and fragments of memory. But scattered truth is invisible truth. Without someone to gather the pieces, to declare that they mattered, to demand uncomfortable questions be asked, the truth might as well not exist at all. The president's house stood gleaming in the Washington sun, perhaps the most recognizable building in America. Visitors came from across the nation to admire it. School children studied its history. Artists painted it. Photographers captured it. Politicians worked within its walls. And beneath their feet, in unmarked graves scattered across the grounds, lay at least a dozen people who had built the very foundation those visitors walked upon. No one knew their names. No one knew where they were buried. No one knew how they had died, or how many others had died beside them. The questions that should have been asked in 1797 were never asked. The investigations that should have happened in 1867, 1891, or 1901 never took place. The recognition that should have been given was never offered. The carved names remained sealed behind plaster. The bones stayed buried in the earth. The documents stayed scattered and unread. And the comforting myth that the president's house was built entirely by skilled craftsmen under ordinary conditions remained undisturbed. In the black neighborhoods of Washington, some people still knew differently. The elders would point toward the White House and say, "My people built it with their own hands and got nothing for it." Some of them died building it and were buried right there on those grounds. But you won't read that in any book. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren heard those stories, but didn't always believe them. The tale sounded too harsh, too painful, too accusing toward the nation's proudest symbol. Surely, they thought, if enslaved people had built the White House and died doing it, that would be recorded in history. Surely the government would acknowledge something so important. But it wasn't in the books. The government never mentioned it. The stories were true, but they survived only through oral tradition among the descendants of the enslaved, while the written history told a cleaner, safer version. This is how truth dies, not in one single act of suppression, but through 1,000 small decisions to look away, to stay silent, to choose comfort over honesty. Herbert Bancroft removed his section to protect his payment. Henry Reed rebared the bones to avoid scandal. Renovation supervisors ordered plaster to be placed over carved names instead of facing what they meant. Each decision seemed reasonable in isolation. Each silence had its justification. But the sum of all those silences meant that the people who built the White House with their bare hands, who died in the process, who carved their names in stone hoping to be remembered, those people were forgotten anyway. The White House still stands today, more than a century after those bones were uncovered and reburied. It stands on foundations laid by people whose names were erased from history. It was built with labor that was never compensated, never acknowledged, never honored. And for generations after 1902, the comforting mythology endured, because the truth had been buried too often, too deeply, by too many people who chose not to see it. This mystery shows us how historical truth can be methodically erased through seemingly reasonable choices, how institutional silence can be more powerful than censorship itself, and how people can create the most famous symbols in the world while remaining completely invisible. It reminds us that the price of preserving comfortable myths is often paid by those with no voice to protest, no power to demand remembrance, and no way to make history admit they ever existed. What do you think happened to those workers whose names vanished from the records? How many do you believe really died? Leave your thoughts below. If you found this story as haunting as it truly is, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, ring the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear these forgotten stories. See you in the next one.